should be. Yep. Looks like we are live. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us this week for our online midweek service. I'm Pastor Josh Robinson, and joining me today
is Derek Angel.
Derek, thanks for joining me today. And today we should wrap up our part 2 of the Garden City series that we've been doing here at New Haven Church. And basically, to kind of catch you up to speed, basically what that has been is we moved into a new building, right? And we moved into the heart of the downtown area in Madison, West Virginia. And doing that caused us to have to rethink kind of our strategy as a church, right? Because we went from being kind of out in the middle of nowhere in Logan County to being right in the center of downtown in Madison, West Virginia. So we moved counties. And then we also moved from being like literally in the middle of nowhere to like right in the heart of town. So we've had to rethink some things, right? And so what we've been doing at the church, this is the second series that we've done, but we've had a series called Garden City. And basically what we've said is, hey, we want Madison, West Virginia to be transformed into a garden city for the glory of God. Now, why is it exactly that we've been using the language of Garden City? Well, it's basically because that's God's intentions for the entirety of creation, right? What was it that he put man and woman in the beginning, Derek?
He puts, what is it now? I'm sorry.
I said, what was it that God put man and woman in the beginning?
In a garden.
In a garden, right? And whenever we look at the end of the Bible, where does the story end at? It ends in a garden city.
In the new heaven and the new earth.
That's right.
Garden.
That's right. In Revelation chapter 21, we see that, you know, after God has separated the sheep from the goats and that kind of thing, we see that there's a new heaven and that there's a new earth. And we see the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, and it's prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And we see that God's dwelling place is with man, and we see that he's going to dwell with his people. We see that God's going to wipe away the tears from the eyes that are there. There's not going to be any crying anymore. There's not going to be pain anymore. The former things are going to pass away. And then we see that this city is going to come down, this holy city, the holy New Jerusalem. In verse 10 of Revelation 21, it says, "He carried me away into the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God." And it has this glory and its radiance. It's got these rare jewels like jasper, clear as crystal. It's got great high walls. It's got the gate of the 12 angels, and on the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. We see that. And then in Revelation 22, we basically see that the river of the water of life is flowing through this city. And in the middle of the city, we see that on each side of the river is the tree of life again. Right? What's that take us back to? That takes us back to the Garden of Eden, right? So basically what we see the Bible moving from, we see it moving from a garden to a garden city, right? We've got this holy city, the New Jerusalem, going to come down out of heaven, or I think that it's already here. I think that the church is that new holy city. But we see that, and we see that rivers are flowing from this city out to water the world, and the tree of life is there, right? So I think in some ways that speaks of the sacramental realities that are currently present in the church. I also think that's a future event later on, but it's also present already here now. So that's why we've been framing it that we want to see Madison, West Virginia transformed into a garden city, right? That's why we picked that particular mission, because that's God's mission for all of creation. Now, so we've done two sessions in this series already, right? And so basically we said that in order to see Madison, West Virginia transformed into a garden city to the glory of God, we've got to take a couple steps back, right? And one of the things that we talked about is we have to have our homes in order before we can see
step one.
That's step one, right? Our homes need to be a miniature version of this garden city, right? They need to be thriving. We need to be like trees planted by streams of living water, right? That kind of thing. Psalm 1. And then we took another step forward here and we say, okay, before we can see Madison, West Virginia transformed into a garden city, our churches also have to be miniature versions of a garden city as well, right? They have to be healthy. They have to be thriving. And we talked about what that looks like for the home and for the church. So if you guys are interested in that and you want more on that, go back and see the past 2 sessions that we did. They should be here on our Facebook page, and they should be there for you. So today we're going to talk about, okay, now that we've talked about these first 2 steps, how is it that we engage our context, our city, that kind of thing, right? So that's where we're at in this one. And so to kind of frame our discussion and to kind of get us started, I want to talk about a character that you've probably never heard of, unless you've heard me talking about him, but his name is Wren. And so Wren is kind of a cultural analyst. He's a Christian. And so basically he's kind of framed things this way. He says that we are currently living in a time, in an era, that is negative towards Christianity.
I can see that.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And because it's negative to Christianity, we have to think through a strategy that takes that into account.
Right.
And so I've got an article here pulled up from him, and basically he says this. He says, in recent decades, the church has passed through 3 eras or worlds in terms of how American society perceives and relates to the church. He says these are the positive, the neutral, and the negative worlds, with the names referring to the way that society views Christianity. So here's what he says. He says, pre-1994, we lived in what was called the positive world. He says Christianity was viewed positively by society. Christian morality was still yet normative, right? And to be seen as a religious person and one who exemplifies traditional Christian norms was a social positive. Mm-hmm. Christianity was a status enhancer. In some cases, failure to embrace Christian norms actually would have hurt you in this society. And I think that for you and at least me, I was born in the 80s. Mm-hmm. You were right there on the cusp, probably in the 90s.
Yeah, right in 1990.
Right, but you would have remembered some of this, right? Both of us would have seen some of this in our childhood growing up.
Yeah.
And for those who are listening right now in on today's session, who are older than us,
right,
born back in the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, you guys would have seen a lot of this, right? Like there was a time in society that being a Christian, it was viewed as a social positive.
Yeah.
And it was something that was if you didn't embrace that in some ways, it would probably actually hurt you in society.
Right.
You know, that makes me remember things. It was right there, you know, a little bit before our age, called the moral majority, and that's basically was a political movement of people like Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, that kind of thing. And basically, what they were saying was that the moral majority, the people who were voting, they were a moral majority, and they were Christians, and right, so that was the positive world. Wren says.
I could definitely see that. I mean, back in that time, everybody was involved in church.
That's right.
I mean, everybody, Sunday mornings, Wednesday, Sunday dinners, the whole 9 yards.
I remember growing up, and whenever we were growing up, I remember we used to actually take days off of practice from sports.
Yeah.
Because people would go to church.
They held it to a higher degree than what you see as today. Back then, even with when you meet somebody new, they ask, well, what church do you attend?
Right.
But nowadays, it's, well, what organization or what club are you organized with or you're affiliated with?
Yep.
There's been a big shift in
big,
that throughout. So I could definitely see where he's coming from.
Yeah. So he says from 1994 to 2014, we entered what was called the neutral world. And so here's what he says. He says Christianity here is seen as a socially neutral attribute. It no longer had the dominant status in society, but to be seen as a religious person was not a knock either. It was more like a personal affection or a hobby. Right? Christian moral norms were retained some residual force. So you've probably seen this too. And so basically the way that this played out in society, later on it's not necessarily that it's a positive thing, but they'll say, well, if that's what you like to do, if that's your faith and what you believe, then you go ahead and do that, right? Well, nobody's going to infringe on that if that's what you believe in.
Right.
So, which takes us to now. He says from 2014 to currently, We are now living in what is called the negative world. And he says, in this world, being a Christian is now a social negative, especially in high-status positions. Christianity, in many ways, is seen as undermining the social good, and Christian morality is expressly repudiated. I think that's a great statement of where we're at.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you go out and you apply to a job now, like say you're working your way up the corporate ladder, right?
Yeah.
And you apply for a job and you're doing an interview and you mention your faith, one of the things is, do you think that you can keep that private?
Right.
Right?
I can see that.
Yeah. Like, do you think that that's going to cause you issues with this, or this? Because here at this company, this is what we're about.
Right.
Whether it be, diversity or whatever. You know what I mean? So those things are pitted against each other and seen as negative. And now, you see this too, obviously, in the differences that have occurred over the years. I think that he's using this date with what's called Obergefell, which is the whole marriage thing. When same-sex marriages were legalized and seen as more than just legal unions and that kind of thing. So basically, what he's saying is that now, if you're not affirming of things like that, your faith is now seen as negative.
Right.
And I'm sure that people who are listening in on this evening's episode can probably relate to that. You've probably experienced that, especially on social media or in your workplace or with friends.
In this day and time and cultural age that we're in, it would almost be impossible to get around to get around it, honestly.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. And so he kind of goes on here, and he kind of lays out what the cultural strategies were for these worlds. And so he said that, whenever the positive world was a thing, Christians were doing what was called the culture war strategy. And he said the culture war strategy and participants had a number of general characteristics. It was highly combative and oppositional versus the emergent secular culture. He says, by and large, the people we associate it with today were located in the citadels of culture, often were located far from the citadels of culture, often in backwater areas. They tended to use their own platforms, such as paid-for UHF television shows, such as the primary means for reaching and influencing people. They were initially funded primarily by donations from the flock, giving them marketing-driven style. He said they migrated away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party and became a key Republican voting bloc in the 80s. He said cultural figures for this movement included some of the people I mentioned earlier. He says Jerry Falwell of Liberty University, Pat Robinson of CBN, Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition. And so basically, this is what I was talking about earlier. And so, like, if you've ever looked on television and you see all the Christian channels on there, like TBN, right, or CBN, that's one of them's the Trinity Broadcasting Network, and there's a Christian Broadcasting Network, where you've got all these preachers that are constantly going. That was a strategy in the old positive world, and that's why they're still around. But the problem is that nobody's paying attention to that stuff anymore, except for Christians. At one point, it was really influential. Now, it's not. So. Right. So that was the culture war strategy for the positive world. So whenever the world turned to the negative world, the strategy changed a little bit, and it changed to what's called cultural engagement. Now, we used that language a little bit here in our post. We said, how do we engage with culture? And it says, the characteristic of the neutral world strategy was much different and can be summed up under the heading of cultural engagement, a term many of its practitioners use itself. He says its characteristics were very different from the culture war strategy. He says it was positive, not oppositional toward secular culture. Its practitioners sought to confidently engage with secular culture in a pluralistic public square. It downplayed area where Christianity is in conflict with the secular culture in topics such as like abortion, and it preferred to highlight areas where Christianity was seen in agreement with secular culture, for example, care for the immigrant. Its leading lights were heavily located in urban and global city areas and exhibited a multicultural emphasis. Neutral world leaders had their own platforms and sought strategic influence through the access to elite secular media outlets. They tended towards more public. They tended towards being publicly apolitical, so they're kind of in the middle, right? They choose not to call out the Republicans or the Democrats. They're kind of in the middle. He says, though many did denounce Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
He said they tended to become increasingly hostile towards the religious right. In effect, they engaged in a culture war too, but against the religious right, not society at large. He said key neutral world figures and institutions include people like Tim Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, Hillsong Church, right, and James Davidson Hunter of University of Virginia. And so basically, you've probably seen this, right? So think of Hillsong, right? What is it that they're focused on? They're not ever focused on calling out secular culture, right? They're actually, I would say that they're actually focused in on kind of copying it as far as they can,
right?
And kind of adopting it in some ways, right? Yeah. That's what the neutral world does,
right?
So it's not going to be oppositional towards secular culture. It's going to try to adopt it, and it's not going to.
It's like a mesh.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's you see that in the middle of the road kind of stance, right? It's like that's how you could. That's kind of the strategy for it. So he goes on and he says, all right, well, we've moved from this neutral world where that's not going to work anymore. Is basically what he says. He's like, you can be winsome and not call out secular culture. But that doesn't change the fact that they now view you in a negative light just because you're simply a Christian.
Right. I could see that.
Yeah. Well, for example, Tim Keller. He's like one of the most winsome people in the world. People may not know who Tim Keller is, but if you don't, you can just go Google him, check him out on YouTube. Very soft-spoken, older man now. He's got cancer, and but pastor, who's in
He's
New York.
put out some great books too.
Yeah, I've got quite a few books over there that I've been really helped by.
Yeah.
But basically, he, very winsome, very non-confrontational. But get this, he was canceled a few years ago at Yale University.
Really?
Simply because I think it was because he denied female ordination.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And so basically what Aaron Wren's point is that is now the world you live in. You live in a world that is now hostile towards you. And being winsome and trying to adopt the ways of the culture, that's not going to persuade them anymore. Like you can come out with the greatest Hillsong album in the world and sound just like the world, but that's not going to be enough to persuade them anymore. They see your beliefs now as problematic. And so here's what he says. There is no cultural strategy for the negative world. Nobody's developed it yet, basically is what he says.
I don't think he's too far off, to be completely honest. Mm-hmm. I think he's right on.
The closest thing that we've seen so far, there's a book called Rod Dreher, a guy named Rod Dreher. He wrote a book called The Benedict Option, and basically what he said was that we needed to pull back out of society and preserve our culture in little cells, basically like St. Benedict did whenever Rome fell.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rome fell, St. Benedict, he founded the monastery, and as Rome fell, culture was preserved in his monastery. Right. And so basically that's what he's saying. We need to do that with our local churches. We need to pull back, and we need to preserve our culture here. And I think that in some ways he's got some of that right. So, yeah. But we're going to talk now about our strategy for how it is that we think that we can engage with this negative world. Now, let me say this. I don't think that things are as negative in Madison, West Virginia as they could be.
No, you look off into the bigger cities or out west. It's a culture shock. You just got back from Asheville.
Yes,
I'm sure that it was a huge culture shock from here to there. Even.
Oh yeah, it was very secular.
Right.
Very, very secular. So yeah, like I could totally see it in like cities and rural, or not rural, but urban places.
Right.
It's very, very different than it is here. And you've got the whole saying too that Boone County, Logan County, West Virginia, Coalfields area is 20 years behind everywhere else.
Yeah.
So maybe one day, I don't think that's necessarily true. I just think that rural places are different
right.
than urban places. To me, from what I've seen, rural places tend to just be more conservative,
Mm-hmm.
and the people here care more about freedom and liberty, and that's why they move here.
Absolutely.
Because you don't have all of the red tape that you have to deal with as you would in a city, big city somewhere, right? So that's what I think's going on with a lot of it. So I don't think that it's necessarily we're behind the times thing as much as the city and the country are just different,
right.
and that's just how it is.
Yeah.
That's my own spin on it. That's my own take. So, all right, but here let's get into some of our strategy here. I think that Rod Dreher is absolutely right. I think that we do need to be creating in our churches culture, creating and preserving music, theology, all of those art, all of those things, 100%. But I think that we also need to not fall back into the posture of withdrawal.
Right.
Right. The apostles, I think, lived in a negative world.
Mm-hmm.
They lived in an age where they were martyred. All of the apostles, except for John, was martyred, and they tried to martyr him. They actually boiled him alive in oil, and he didn't die. Right. And then they exiled him to Patmos, where he eventually, died of old age. Well, maybe he came back. I can't remember. I'd have to look at what his history was. But they were all murdered and martyred except for John.
Right.
So I don't think that we're dealing with something that's not been dealt with before. Christianity has lived in negative worlds before. And so I think that brings us to the first thing here. One of the things that as Christians we need to practice that I think would be effective is the practice of hospitality. Hospitality. And so we see that with the apostles themselves in Acts chapter 2 in verse 42. And so here we see that after the gospel was preached, right, and that whole thing, and the day of Pentecost, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And then awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and their belongings and distributing the needs and the proceeds, distributing the proceeds to all as they had need. Day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. This is a negative world they're living in.
Yep.
Right? This is Jerusalem under the dominion of pagan Rome. And yet, we see here that they're not just withdrawn from culture. They are together privately, but then they're going out publicly as well. But we see here explicitly there is hospitality going on, right? They're inviting one another and others into the home. Right? There were no church buildings at this point.
Right.
Let's get that straight.
Right.
Okay? We're blessed to have a church building.
Right.
We're all blessed to have church buildings. But let's be real. There were no church buildings in Acts chapter 2. So where were they having these meals at? In their homes. In their homes. And so we see that they're breaking bread. They're praying together. They're fellowshipping with one another. And I think that that's one of the strategies that we have to adopt. Yeah. And we do adopt that at New Haven Church with our community groups, and that looks really weird here, right? Like nobody else that I'm aware of is inviting one another into the homes or inviting unbelievers into the homes. But that's been a majorly effective strategy for us, has it not?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead and talk about that a little bit, because actually you heard the gospel through community groups.
My whole testimony, me in general, I avoided church buildings for the longest time.
As most people in a negative world do.
Right. And I had just moved into a neighborhood and hadn't been there probably a year. And then an elder candidate here at our church, Chris and his family, was building a home in my community. And we was just taking a walk through our neighborhood with me and my wife and my children. Yeah. And we seen them outside. As soon as their house was done, they was moved in and stuff. But on this specific day, they was outside, and we went over to introduce ourselves and the whole 9 yards, and they said, "Why don't you guys come in?" And they invited us in. It was just an experience like I've never had. Like I don't know how to put it that way, because I mean the focus was on Scripture. Like you was even there that evening. Don't get me wrong, there was fellowship and that people was cutting up and having a good time. There was food and the whole 9 yards, but the main topic of the reason why everybody was there was to talk about Scripture. And that there, in somebody's home, I felt so much more humble. I felt more comfortable. I felt I was able to express concern, questions. There I could question different things that I had learned about in the Bible as of, I wouldn't normally do in front of 50, 60 people at a church building during a church service through midweek.
Right.
And that was whenever I was actually able to hear the gospel through and through, completely thorough, for the first time in my life.
Yeah.
And it was able to where I was one-on-one with other believers. If I had questions, we talked about it. And that's where I think that I had put my faith in God had saved me that evening there at that home. Yeah. So.
Well, and you're not the only person that's experienced that. I would say that the majority of people, I mean, there's been some differences now that we've landed a building, but the majority, the core of our congregation, heard the gospel and became a part of our church through the act of hospitality. Right. Somebody invited them to their home and invited them over for a meal, and then the gospel was talked about, and there were conversations that were had. And I think that people neglect how important and how powerful that can be because they think that you need to get people into the church building to be able to hear the gospel. But the thing is that in the negative world, a world that is hostile to Christianity, the odds of you getting people into your church building are now a lot lower. Yeah. I mean, for example, we're doing a series on revivals right now.
Well, and even surprisingly, it's wild because you see less people coming into the church, but the most profound thing that I hear in our area in Madison is you need to get to the church, go to the altar, and you need to be saved. Right. You have to go to the altar to be saved. And I mean, you would think that would, draw more people to the church of saying, like, well, I need to get to the church and get to the altar to be saved. But in flip, like, we're experiencing that the mass majority of our church, and to know we don't do, we that's another thing different within our church. But the mass majority of our church has come to faith through home groups of just the proclamation of the gospel. Yeah. In somebody's home.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's what we see here in Acts chapter 2 in a negative world, right? And it says, and day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Right. So, one of the old strategies I think of the positive world was the revival. Right. Right. Whenever you had a majority of people who at least were Christian or at least had Christian values, everybody used to come out to the revival, like believers and unbelievers. I mean, there was even a time whenever I was in that world and that happened. But now, like, you hear people talking about revivals, and the majority of the people who come out to revivals nowadays aren't people who are unbelievers. But now, most of the time, it's people from other churches who just want to come and fellowship, right? Why is that? It's because we now live in a world where Christianity is viewed as hostile. They have no interest in coming and hearing the gospel. So, you, have to invite them to somewhere else, the home and hospitality. And now this is the second thing. You have to engage them where they're at. Now, there's a couple ways that we can do that. I'll say there's two ways that we can do that. Number one is vocation. Number two is just straight up old school evangelism. Yeah. So let's get into that. So what do I mean by vocation? Well, by vocation, I mean what God has called you to do vocationally, like your job. Right. Right. You're a coal miner. right? You're also an elder candidate at New Haven Church. I'm a full-time pastor, but I'm also fixing to start doing real estate. Mm-hmm. That is vocation, right? Using what it is God has called you to, but using it to leverage the gospel, right? So what you want to do is you want to use whatever it is that God's called you to engage people there, right? So you're not just sitting on the defense, right? You're active. You're actively going after it. And that's what the apostles were doing. You know, we see in Acts and that Paul was a tent maker.
Right.
So that means that, you know, he had a vocation of making tents. He used that to make money and to support himself financially. But what he also did was he used that as a means to share the gospel with people.
Right.
And to fund his work of ministry.
Right.
Right? And so...
As you should.
I mean,
you shouldn't run into one of your coworkers, or say my wife ran into one of my coworkers, and she invited him to church and be like, wow, Derek goes to church?
Right.
Like, that's a problem.
Yeah, well, so, and in this negative world that we're in, that's totally a common thing.
Right.
Like where we were talking about, even in the neutral world, we were talking about that Christianity was kind of viewed as this private devotion thing.
Right.
And so, like, to evangelize someone or to use your vocation to talk about your faith, that's something that would be frowned upon. But we're just going to have to be courageous and use that as a means to get that message out there. And so there's various ways you can do that. Obviously, you can you can just use your business that God had, or whatever it is that God's called you to right now, your job.
Right.
Another way that you can do that, though, is by becoming a business owner, right? And we have people in our church who own businesses. Like we own a business. You guys own a business. We have other people in our church who owns businesses. And the thing that I think's great about that is that allows you to leverage. You don't have some. We were talking about earlier. Like you have the interview, right? You're moving up the corporate ladder,
right? And
then you tell the person that you're interviewing with that you're a Christian. And then it immediately raises red flags,
right?
You don't have that if you own your own business.
It's true.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a good thing, I think. And so I think that there's a lot of value in that. And you can center your business around your faith.
Right.
You know, you can work with other people who are Christians, with churches, you know, all those types of things. But I think that one of the things that's big about that is Aaron Wren, again, this is another article he wrote for an organization called First Things. He talks about that one of the things that Christians did and what conservatives did was that they withdrew from culture, and what they did was they gave the enemy the opportunity to kind of set up shop and end up in places that are really good, like business fronts in downtown areas, right?
Right.
And so he talks about that one of the things that the church should seek to do is to reclaim properties in downtown areas and that kind of thing, because whenever you do that, nobody cares if you're on the outskirts. Right? Nobody cares. But whenever you're in a downtown area, you become very difficult to dislodge.
It's true.
And you're going to have people who want that.
Right.
We've already experienced this.
Yeah.
You're going to want people, and the reason why is because whenever you're in the center of something, that's a great place to be. It's whenever you're in the margins of somewhere instead of at the center of it, people don't have to listen to you there. But if you're at the center of something,
right,
people are forced to take a look at you. And so he talks about that he thinks one of the things that Christians should aim at in the negative world is he calls it taking up space. Taking up space. Putting your churches in the hearts of downtown areas, or not just that, but starting businesses in these areas. Take up space. And I think that is a really, really good strategy.
I think it's part of the Great Commission Jesus talks about and commands us to do.
Yeah.
The more space we take up in the nations, I mean, the more His word is going to be spread throughout the nations.
Yeah. Yep. I think you're right. So that's a couple ways that you can use your vocation. Martin Luther says, he says it this way too. You don't have to think of your business as being strictly evangelistic.
Right.
Luther said, or supposedly said, we don't know if he actually said this or not, but it's attributed to him. And whoever it's attributed to, I think it's a good quote. But the quote is that the Christian shoemaker doesn't do his duty by putting crosses on all the shoes that he makes.
Mm-hmm.
He does his duty before God by simply making good, God-glorifying shoes.
Right.
And I think that's good, right? Christians should be, with their vocation and businesses or whatever it is, they should be seeking to do whatever it is to the glory of God.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, that opens doors. That starts conversations. Hey, why is what you're doing so much better than the person who is not a believer down the street, right? So anyway,
I think that's spot on.
I think that another thing too here, and this is probably going to be controversial, is political engagement.
Mm-hmm.
People do not like whenever you talk about church and state.
Right.
People don't like the idea of Christian morality being legislated, and that's very controversial. But here's the reality. Somebody is going to legislate their morality.
Right.
That's inevitable. As we are seeing, it's either going to be God's morality or man's morality. There is no neutrality here.
Right.
There is no neutrality. Either you will have God's morality and his way of doing things, which is good for society and healthy for society and causes society to thrive. God says, "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked nor sit in the seat of sinners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." He, the person who meditates on the law of God, will be like a tree planted by the streams of living water that bear its fruit in its season, and its leaf shall not wither.
Right.
Right? He says, but the wicked are not so, but are like the chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly will not sit in the congregation of the righteous. So God's law, God's way of doing things, God's morality, that's not something that Christians should shrink back from.
Right.
And whenever the enemy accuses you of saying, hey, you're wanting to legislate Christian morality, you as a Christian should say, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, because Christian morality is better than non-Christian morality.
Right.
Christian morality causes societies to be like trees planted by streams of living water that bear fruit. Why would I not want that? Yes, you are right. I am a Christian. Absolutely.
Right. And two, Romans 13 teaches us that we should be, I think it's Romans 13, it teaches us that we should be submissive to our government and elected officials.
Right.
Why wouldn't we want to try to pursue that? If we're going to be submitted to these officials, why not pursue that seat to be involved in that to where we have Christian elected officials to submit to?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And here's the other thing, too, is Paul in Romans 13 says that the civil government, the magistrate, is God's diakonos in Greek, which means his deacon,
right,
his servant. So if we are supposed to submit ourselves to God's servant, shouldn't we hold them accountable and make sure that they are acting as God's servant?
Right, absolutely. By
them submitting themselves to God's standards. I submit that we should.
Absolutely.
That's something that I think that Christians should be doing, and we shouldn't be afraid of the claim that we're trying to legislate morality. Yes, absolutely we are, and guess what? You are too.
Right.
We all. The legislation of morality is inevitable.
Right.
Morality will be legislated. The question is, whose morality will be legislated? By what standard, right? Whose morality will be legislated? Either God's or man's. One can lead to thriving and prosperity and covenantal blessings,
right,
or the others will lead to apostasy and covenantal curses.
Right.
So take your pick. Which one do you want? So that's one thing that I think that Christians should be involved with. I think that you should be at your town meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you should seek to run for local offices.
Right.
I think that you should be at the PTA meetings, whatever, if that's even a thing anymore. I don't even know if it's called a PTA anymore, but whatever. You should be seeking to be salt and light in that. Do you know? I don't know if people know what it means to be salt and light. That's a combination of heaven and earth. Salt's earth, light's heaven. But salt is a preservative.
Right.
Like it preserves things from decaying and rotting. In the ancient world, there wasn't refrigeration, so they had to preserve things somehow. How did they do that? Well, they did it through salting things. You know, you catch Jesus and his disciples. They go out and they catch a bunch of fish in their nets, and they got to take it to the town square to sell it. Right? Well, how they preserve that? How they keep it from spoiling and going bad? They take salt and they just rub it down with tons of salt, which is plentiful in that area of the world. So that's what salt does. It keeps things from rotting and decaying and dying. And that's what we're called to do. Right. We are called the salt of the earth, right? Jesus says we are salt and light, right? So that means that we ought to take up space and be salty and keep things from decaying further than they already have. We need to have this preservative character to our ministry. Now, light, obviously, is it shines in the darkness, right? The earth was formless and void. It was dark and all of that things. And then the light of heaven comes in and it illuminates it, right? That's what we're supposed to do as God's church. So don't be ashamed of that.
Right.
Don't be ashamed of that. Even though you may live in a negative world, that doesn't mean that you have to be ashamed of your faith. So anyway. So I would say that the next way is through evangelism, just straight evangelism.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we've sought to do this is last year's Coal Festival. We hung out, we mingled, and then like 3 or 4 of us, I can't remember how many at this point, we kind of broke off and we had gospel tracts, and we just went out and had conversations with people and gave them tracts, right? Yeah. You could do that. You could do what other people like Jeff Durbin and Apologia Church do so great, just straight evangelism on streets, bringing the gospel into conflict with the darkness.
Right.
And so I think that that's a good strategy as well. So that's what I would say. These 3 things, right? Hospitality, vocation, and, well, I guess those 2 things, because vocation really is, evangelism is different than vocation. So for those 3 things, hospitality, vocation, and evangelism, these are the ways that we can engage our community. Right. But we got to bring this thing back around. But before we do that, we have to make sure that the other things are in place with the local church and with the home, right? You need to have elders who are qualified men.
Right.
You need to be preaching the word and the sacraments, right? And you need to have multiple elders, not just one.
Yeah.
You need to be worshiping the way that God commands us to worship in the Scriptures, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, right? Those types of things. And then you need to be leading out in your home, right? Male, masculine leadership, right? The rule of the father in the home. That's not something as Christians we should be ashamed of.
Right.
That's what Scripture says.
Right.
It clearly says that the man is the head of the home. He is the head, and now that doesn't mean that he's a tyrant. That doesn't mean that he's a dictator or any of those things. But it means that he represents his family to God and represents God to his family.
Right.
And so those are things that we have to have in place in our homes and in our church before we can ever faithfully engage and affect the city or the town or the culture or the state, whatever it is you want to call it.
Right.
I think that another effective thing that churches can do is partner together with other churches, other like-minded churches. I'm just going to say this. If churches aren't doing the things that I mentioned earlier, they don't have male qualified leadership, if they're not preaching the word and the sacraments, if they're not worshiping the way that the Lord has commanded by singing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, it's not a church.
It's true. I agree wholeheartedly.
It's not a church. It may be a social club. It may even be a parachurch ministry,
Right.
but it's not a church. Until we get these things right, the majority of what people believe to be churches out there are not actually churches.
That's true.
And that's the reason why we're not affecting the culture,
Right.
because we have abandoned the things that God has called us to. And until we get back on the straight and narrow here, we're not going to be effective.
Right.
And so we have to get those things right.
It's the same sense in those other churches and organizations that you're talking about. God has ordained through His Word of how this is supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
and we expect God to bless it.
Yeah.
But if we're not following God's guidelines into doing this, how can we expect? I mean, how can we expect Him to bless us in that situation?
Yeah. Well, it's basically like God gives you the terms of the covenant. It's like, here, do this, you'll be blessed. Don't do it, and you won't be.
Right.
And it's basically like we think that we can look at this and be like, you know what? I know, God, that you said to do it this way, but you know what? I think I'm going to tweak this a little bit.
Right.
And I think I'm going to add in my little spin and touch here, and we think that God's going to bless that, and He's not.
Right.
That's not how He works. And the whole Torah and the law and the prophets is just a testimony to that's not how God works.
Right.
We see that all throughout the history of Israel. They want to put their own unique spin on things here and there, and you see what happens, right?
Right.
You end up in exile in Babylon, not effective, not engaging the culture, so not affecting the culture, I should say. And so I think that's a good strategy for the negative world.
Right.
There is the preservative, or there is the backing up part and preserving culture, right? Like, you should be doing these things in your churches. You should be doing Christian education in your churches.
Right.
You should be passing that on to your children, which we talked about that a little bit in the home.
Yeah.
But you should be seeking to do this. You should be creating Christian art. You should be doing all of those cultural endeavors. But we also have to step out and engage the culture in some ways, and we can't do it in the way that it was done in the negative or the neutral world, where people were in the middle and neutral on things and didn't want to call out abuses here and there. You have to be faithful and do that.
Right.
So,
That's good.
well, that's about all I got. We've been going for 47 minutes. It's mostly just been me rambling. But guys, if you're watching live and you're a member at New Haven Church and you've got any questions about anything that we've said tonight, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. We would love to answer any kind of questions that you may have. If you need us to clarify something for you, let us know. We'd love to clarify anything if we've not been clear, or if you've been encouraged and if you think that this is good and you think, hey, like, this is challenging and you're right, I need to implement this in my life. Hey, let us know in the comments below, right? We're learning some of this stuff together. We're walking through this content together, and we're all learning here, right? So.
Yep.
Well, Derek, do you have anything else before we sign off?
I think we've pretty well covered about everything on that. It's been a good 3 series. Hopefully, you guys, if you're just tuning in again to this video, backtrack. There's 2 other videos to this. It'll elaborate, make a lot more sense to come up to speed as to why we're covering this topic this evening.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been fun. It's really helped me out a lot.
Yeah, it's been really good. Like he said, these will be available for you guys to watch if you want. I know it's different online than it is in person, right? But it is what it is for right now. And so this will be the last session in the Garden City session. After this, we'll be taking a break. There won't be any midweek anything. There won't be any of this. And I think that we're planning on starting up community groups again. We were originally going to start them next week, but I think that we're fixing to shove them back till after the New Haven camping trip.
Yeah.
Because how far away is that?
2 weeks out.
2 weeks out. So what would happen is we would be doing them next week, and then we would have a week off immediately because of the camping trip, and then we would have another week after that. So that'll give us time to get everything in order. So 3 weeks from now, I think, is when we'll be starting them. That'll give us time to get things in order. We're also planning on doing a teaching series in community groups through the Apostles' Creed. So if you're a New Haven Church member and if you've been saying the Apostles' Creed with us for a while on our Sunday gatherings, you've always wanted to know what some of those those phrases meant. We're going to be doing a study for that. So make sure in 3 weeks to plug into a community group, right? We've got 2 here in Madison. We've got 1 in Logan County. We may start some in other places too. Very well may do that. If you're interested in that, let us know. We'd love to plug you into a group. But it should be exciting to go through the Apostles' Creed and to dive a little bit deeper into the theology of that and why we believe the things that we believe. And so, all right.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. All right, guys. Hey, well, thank you so much for tuning in to today's midweek service online. We hope that you've been blessed by it, and we'll see you guys